We aren't done yet. This is the second part of how to create a reading habit, here on the CFS story. So, while we're already talking about reading today, I thought that this might also be a perfect time to talk a little bit about how to establish a habit of reading. There seems to be great evidence that people who read a lot of books seem to be more successful in life because they are building on a much greater knowledge. They are trusting not only themselves and everything to come from the inside, but they reach out to people who have a better understanding of a topic than they do. And I think actually Elon Musk said that everything he knows about rockets and his whole SpaceX project, he learned from the books that he read. And so it is not always necessary to get a fancy degree or spend a ton of time with a certain teacher or something. Those can all be great tactics, but reading a lot is a great way of finding whatever success you're looking for, be it a career, financial, or mostly also happiness, satisfaction. All those things are things that you can learn by reading a lot of books and reading people that have figured out things to a certain extent that we probably haven't yet. I did a little bit of research beyond that. I have a little, I have somewhat of a habit established already. I'm reading a good amount of books every year, probably 20-25 books, but I think this can still be way up there. There's a great picture of Stephen King, who is, you all know him. He sold more than 350 million books in his life, and his main advice to aspiring young writers is that if you want to become a writer, you need to read at least 5 hours a day. And although I'm not aiming for 5 hours a day, I'm definitely aiming for establishing a reading habit that I read actually every single day, and at least probably 30 minutes to an hour to really get time to dive into something and not just flip a couple of pages and then be off again. I came across two very interesting articles about how to establish a new habit in reading. And I want to go over one of these because I think it's really interesting. It's written by Neil Pasricha, I might brutalize that name, and it was published in the Harvard Business Review. I'm going to post the link to the website down in the description. And so there are 8 things that he says are important to establish a habit. And the first thing, and I found that to be really interesting, is centralize reading in your home. In your home. 1, centralized reading in your home. And that idea, you probably might have noticed that as well. I used to play, or I still play instruments, but it was always my experience that I tended not to practice when my instrument was in his bag somewhere in the corner of my apartment. And when I really wanted to, when I had a time that was leading up to a concert, when I really needed to practice, what I did is I took out my instrument, put it on a stand right in the middle of my room, because every time I would cross my room, I would see the instrument, I would think about that I still have to practice, and I would just take my bass guitar and start playing a little bit. And even if I didn't have to practice, I still took it because it was there in the middle of the room. And the idea with centralizing reading in your home is exactly that. You want to make reading and books as present as possible in your room so that you always see it in front of you, and that whenever you walk past your room, you see your bookshelf with all those exciting books that you still haven't read, that just leads you to taking one out. And I think a good strategy to do so is to get rid of all the electronics out of your room, especially out of your bedroom, put it in another part of your house or apartment, and then put your shelf, your bookshelf, right in the center of that or exactly that spot in the house that you see most often. And I think this getting rid of things very visible that you don't want to do all the time. For example, I like to play with my Nintendo Switch, play Mario Kart and all these things, but if I would have stand it outside so I could just grab it when I get home from school, I'd probably play every time, because once I walk past, I get reminded, oh, I could like play a little bit, and so I'll take it, and then I'll play much longer than I thought, and then in the end I didn't read again. And so putting away those things that might distract you and keeping out the bookshelf in a very central location is the first First point, centralize reading in your home. Point 2 is make a public how do you write that word? Commitment. Point 2, make a public commitment. The idea behind that is, and I think you all have probably heard about these apps where you can give in a certain amount of money. You're saying I quit smoking, and you put an amount of money in an account, $5 every week, and you give yourself a time frame, let's say, and within the next 3 months I want to quit. And at the end of the time, if you have not achieved what you wanted to do, all the money that you have put into this account goes to an organization that you absolutely detest, like the KKK or something like that, like something that you really don't want to get your money, like a place that you really don't want to have your money. And so this idea of making a public commitment is by saying out loud that you are trying something new, that you want to establish this habit. You kind of increase the pressure, because you have this little bit of peer pressure that tells you, once I talked a lot about this, not following through might be a little bit even embarrassing, and so you're trying to avoid that. And so by making this public commitment, you get the chance to stick to your habit. And exactly this is what I did for my vlog. When I started about this idea, I was afraid of caving out before I could start, because I was so afraid of putting myself out there, that I told everyone that I met that I'm going to make a new vlog and that the first episode is coming out on May 1st. And so I did not have any chance to get out of this again. I had told so many people that not doing it would have had a lot of weird conversations that I would want to avoid. And so point 2, making a public commitment. Point 3 is find a curated list. Yeah. Point 3, find a curated list. The idea behind that point is that it can be really demanding picking out the right book. There are 50,000 books being published every year, I think in the US alone. And so this is an amount of books that is not overseeable. So how are you going to find a book that is really worth your time? And a good way of doing so is by looking at reading lists that people have established that you really like, where people that you listen to, that you look up to. And so both of these books that I'm reading over the summer, Vagabonding as well as The History of Western Philosophy, are both books that I haven't chosen randomly, but that I found on a list of books that people put out there that I really trust, Sam Harris and Tim Ferriss. And so by going and finding these lists of people, you're able to at least narrow it down and then try to find a book out of this list that is of particular interest to you. And that way you can avoid having to read a lot of books that are actually not at all what you're interested in, because you just like the title. And so having this kind of peer review of people telling you something that they read and they think is worthwhile is a good way to start getting into that. I know that Bill Gates publishes a list like that. Warren Buffett, I think, too, and those are all very interesting people, and it might be worth, for example, starting out with those. I'm definitely going to post some of the lists down in my description as well, so if you don't know what to read right now, just take a look at those lists and see if there's something on there that might interest you. So point 3 is find a curated list. Point 4 then, it's okay to quit. Another important point, point 4, it's okay to quit. And the importance about this point is that we way too often have this mentality of pushing through, of feeling bad about if we start reading a book and then putting it aside, because we kind of have the feeling that we fail if we don't read the full book. And that is a fallacy, because a lot of books are just not worth reading. There are a ton of good books out there, but there is a much larger amount of books even that are not really worth your time. And so getting into the habit of saying it's okay if I don't like the first 10 pages or 20 pages to just put this book aside. Because if, let's say, you have 5 books and 4 out of these books are some things that don't really interest you after 50 pages, but you have the feeling you need to go through them now because you have started it already, you are going to waste all the time that you could have spent on this one last book that you really like, that gives you a lot, by reading those first 4. And so quitting books that you don't like and spending more time on the ones that you really like and where you get something out of it is our 4th point that is really important, and that is it's okay to quit. Point 5 then is read books, not news. And that is a point that is extremely new to me as well. Point 4, read books, not news. And that is because I love magazines. I always had a lot of subscriptions, a subscription to The Atlantic recently, New York Review, what's that? New York Book Review, The New Yorker, Wired, all those interesting magazines. And the point that Neil was making here in his article is that by going on a news fast, by not reading a lot of these magazines, you are training yourself much more to read long form again. Everything that we're reading nowadays is extremely short. On the internet, it's the shortest. On Twitter, it's 140 characters. On most websites, you have a little bit longer articles. Some, like The New Yorker, have really long ones, but they're still extremely short and not an in-depth analysis of the things that are really important. And so by not reading news for a while, you can, not subscribing to all these magazines, you can save a lot of money that you can invest in particular books that talk about one topic really in depth and get way more out of this. And this is something that I'm going to try. I'm not exactly sure yet if that is exactly what I want to do, but I think it's a really valid argument. So this is definitely something that I'm going to try out. And if you do too, let me know how it goes. So point 4, read books, not news. Point 6 is triple your churn rate. Also something that was completely new to me before reading this article, and that's very interesting. Point 6, triple your churn rate. And the argument that Neil was making here in this article is that we often conceive our bookshelf as something very static that we walk by instead of somehow interacting with it. And so the idea behind tripling your churn rate is that you should not consider your bookshelf as static, but as a very dynamic organism, that you constantly put books in and then out. And that is something that I've recently experienced with friends as well, that gave me read books as a present, and that is something that I want to incorporate much more, is that if you read a book, if you have read it a couple of times and you think you have gotten everything out of it, you might know someone that is interested in your book. And so you go to your shelf, take out those books, give those books to the people that you think might be interested, ask them to give, once they have read the book, it to another person again, and that way you get space again in your bookshelf to buy a couple of new books. Neil says that he every week puts in 5 new ones, takes out 3 out, and there are a couple of great ways of doing it. Buy books used online or in a used bookstore, or go to lending libraries, start like a book sharing thing. And the whole idea behind it is getting a constant circulation in your bookshelf that keeps you engaged with your bookshelf, that not lets you treat it as an artificial object somewhere standing in your household, but as an active part that you constantly use and that you're not afraid of staying away from. So point 6, triple your churn rate. Point 7, and that one is probably to no one's surprise that this is on such a list, is read physical books. Well, that's a point that I think is pretty evident to most people. Point 7, read physical books. There is a problem with reading things online. I read a lot online. I read a lot on my phone, through Twitter and Reddit, and I don't think that it's completely bad, but one thing that we've all realized is that if we read something online, we get easily distracted. Your mail is probably open, Facebook is open at the same time, so once a new message gets in, you switch really quickly only to read this little message before you go back to the text, and that way you already completely wasted your possibility to focus really in on the text that you're interested in. And so the idea behind reading a physical book is that you do not have access to the internet and you do not have access to so much distraction. And I think finding a spot in your house or somewhere where it's quiet, where you can focus in on reading, is really, really important. And doing it on your phone might not be the best idea because you're just distracted all the time. I think that it's fair enough to get a Kindle, especially if you're traveling a lot. It's just easy to carry a lot of books. But I also think that having so many books available at your fingertips again then starts again the question of which book am I choosing, and then you have so many options and you're skipping into one book and not reading really and then skipping to the next book. So if you really want to get deep into reading, the best idea probably might be to limit to yourself to a couple of few books, 2, 3, 4 at most, for a certain amount of time, and read the physical copies of that. So point 7 is read physical books. The last rule is the 10,000 steps rule. That one needs probably a little bit of explanation, and that was also something that was very new to me. Rule 8, the 10,000 steps rule. You probably all have a phone, and on your phone you probably have an activity tracker and a step counter. And I definitely have it, and I have the experience that if I was very close to 10,000 steps, but I wasn't there yet, that I went out again, did a couple of steps so that I get over the 10,000. I know that's an arbitrary line, the 10,000, but still, it's a line that you want to cross, and so you're going an extra mile, you're putting in a little bit of extra time to just get there. And the idea behind that is exactly that you try to find reading time throughout the whole day. And there is a great story that Neil talked about, Stephen King again, which supposedly reads 5 hours a day, and his friend was saying that it's completely balloons, like no one is doing that. And he believed him, and he was very much d'accord with him, saying no one's actually reading 5 hours a day. I can't imagine how are you going to carve out the time. As some of you probably know, Stephen King lives in Maine, and so once Neil did vacations in Maine, and he was standing in line for a movie theater, and a couple of people in front of him was standing Stephen King, and what he was doing, he was reading. He was reading right there in front of him in the line, waiting to get his ticket. And he was reading until the lights in the movie cinema turned down for the movie to start. And then once the lights were turned on again, Stephen King started reading again. And I don't think that I'm going to do it exactly like that, and I don't know if you want to do it exactly like that, but I think the idea is absolutely right behind that. We have way more time in our day than we often think, and there are so many opportunities where you can carve out some time to do something. If you're walking today every school, if you're taking the bus, if you're taking the metro, please not if you drive. But if you have an option, for example, to take a book with you and read it while you're on the go, that is a perfect time to read. That's time well spent that you otherwise would probably just procrastinate, stare out the window, or do something else. So finding this time can be tough, but it is definitely there. And the 10,000 steps rule is the idea that if you haven't read yet throughout the whole day, there's definitely some time in your day left where you can find this time to make time for reading. So rule 8 is the 10,000 steps rule. And so that is the list. Again, I'm going to put that the link to the both articles. There's another one down in the show notes. So if you're interested in doing a little bit more in-depth reading about how to create a habit in reading, do so. I hope that this list of 8 things helps you. I have not tried everything of yet, but I'm going to try a lot of this because I want to increase the time that I spend reading. I want to do this by starting with my project over the summer. And so yeah, this is how I approach creating a new habit. I try to find information, I start strategizing, and once I have a strategy, I try sticking with it for a while to see how it works, and then probably adapt it later. A lot of my vlogs coming up are going to be similar to this. Just trying to get across how I establish habits, how you could establish habits, and how important this strategizing part is. So I hope you liked it. This is it for today. I am going to vlog the next time probably on my way to Europe. Again, there are 2 ways to subscribe. The red button down here, and in the lower left hand corner right there is the logo. Check out the links also in the comment sections, and leave me a comment about your books that you're reading and anything else that you have in your mind about books. See you next week.